Good morning, good afternoon, good evening across the globe. This is a presentation, a webinar by the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo, the director of the Center for Future Consciousness, which produces a newsletter, Future Consciousness Insights. I'm a psychologist, a philosopher, a futurist, a science fiction scholar, I guess. And I've written a number of books on those various topics, which I'm putting up on the screen right now. The three in the middle, Future Consciousness, The Pursuit of Virtue in Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future, are the last three books that I published. And Marlon, who is actually one of the participants today, the two of us are doing a individual kind of webinar on future consciousness. We're going through that one-on-one. The mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightened of future consciousness and wisdom, and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. And this webinar series, which you're participating in, The Evolution of Science Fiction, is based on a course that I've developed, which has been evolving into a book series, Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. And those are the 5 titles of the 5 volumes in the series. One is completed and published, 2 are completed and be published soon, and the last 2 are in process of being written. And today, we're going to be doing module 2 in the evolution of science fiction, mythology, fantasy, and science fiction. And up there, you'll see an image from Star Wars, the original one, and behind it, an image of the Thor assortment of characters from the Thor movies. And both of these movies, the whole series, are interesting combinations of mythology, fantasy, and science fiction, which we will get into as we go along. But I thought that these two particularly captured how science fiction, fantasy, and mythology frequently mix together. And we'll talk about how they mix and how they don't mix. Now, something I'm introducing today, so this would be helpful for people who did not come to the previous webinar. I'm going to be doing like about a 1-minute quick review of what I talked about, what we discussed in the last webinar. So this is a quick review of module 1. I talked about why science fiction creates total person immersion and produces a total way of life. It's a lot more than just the literature. I talked about why science fiction was so popular, that because it produces narratives which generate total person immersion, it gets viewers and readers really into it, and their holistic consciousness gets stimulated. And I gave a definition of science fiction, that it deals primarily with the future through narratives, and is to a significant degree, but not entirely, based on contemporary science and contemporary thinking. That there are many different dimensions of holistic future consciousness, from cinema to magazines to comics to TV to websites to conventions to role modeling, all of which are different aspects of the holistic future consciousness in science fiction. Indeed, science fiction is the integrative future of everything, and not just simply science and technology. And science fiction often stimulates cosmic consciousness. Cosmic consciousness is our awareness of the big picture, the universe as a whole, and of our place and significance within that universe. And I mentioned Olaf Stapleton's Star Maker and Last and First Men in the Time Machine, and James Blish's Surface Tension as examples. Now, here's something else I'm going to be doing through this series. I'm bit by bit introducing participants to key writers and key books within the history of science fiction, and repeatedly going back and mentioning them so that you begin to get a sense of the figures and the most highly regarded stories and novels written within the genre. And last time, of course, I mentioned H.G. Wells, a very significant figure, and talked about The Shape of Things to Come as an important novel. I talked about Robert Heinlein, who was the most popular science fiction writer in the mid-20th century, and Olaf Stapleton and his two monumental cosmic books, Last and First Men and Star Maker. Hugo Gernsback, who coined the expression science fiction. I brought in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, the anthology, which I highly recommend to get a sense of the most highly regarded science fiction stories of the 20th century. Roger Zelazny, who we'll come back to again and again, and Dan Simmons and Hyperion, a fantastic 4-volume series written in the late 1980s into the 90s. Mentioned the Encyclopedia Science Fiction, which is a great resource on the web if you're interested in following up anything I talk about. And I also highlighted Watchmen as a very noteworthy multi-dimensional saga and narrative, both on TV, comics, and in the movies. And then, of course, mentioned Star Trek and the Trekkies. So that was a bit of an overview of Module 1. Now, what I'm also doing as we go through the series, at the beginning, I'm giving you some questions, some points that highlight what are the main things I'm going to talk about within the module. So one thing we're going to talk about today is what are the differences and the similarities of mythology, fantasy, and science fiction. There's going to be differences, but there's also going to be similarities. What is a myth, and what is the power and value of myths? And that will be a significant theme that I'll get into early on here, because we do have myths and they do have a great influence on social consciousness. And then I'm going to illustrate, identify for you all of the different mythic qualities of science fiction, and there are many. And then I'm going to bring up, how does science fiction actually go beyond just simply thinking about the future and writing about it? Because science fiction does go beyond the future. And what is the value of these kinds of experiments and imagination? And that'll come toward the latter part. And then finally, why is, in my mind, science fiction evolutionary mythology? What does that mean? It's mythology, it's contemporary mythology, but it's evolutionary mythology. So those are the main things that I'm going to be talking about today, and those are the questions that I'm asking you to consider, think about as I'm going through this, to give you some points to anchor to and what I'm going to be saying. So, to begin with, history, fantastical nature, and value of ancient myths. Now, first thing we should note is that there's an incredible deep ancient history of telling and recording of mythic tales. This goes back to the beginnings of recorded history 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, BC, excuse me, not 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, 4,000 or 5,000 BC, and probably myths go back even further than that in oral traditions before we began to record them and write them down. So myths have a deep history in our collective social consciousness. And myths, to begin with, are stories. They are narratives. They are not simply abstract theories about the nature of reality. They are stories with characters and drama and events occurring. That is, when we tell myths, we tell stories. And one particular dimension of myths, which repeatedly comes up in ancient times, is stories about extraordinary adventures, where humans often travel to areas and parts of the world that are unknown, that involve fantastic beings and realms that they encounter in traveling on these extraordinary journeys, whether they're in ships or wherever they happen to journey, like the Odyssey and Jason and the Argonauts. But also myths often get into supernatural realms or higher realms where gods and goddesses exist that are otherworldly. And these stories often provide explanations as to what the universe is all about, how did it begin, and where is it going. That's another kind of myth. For example, the myth of the origin of life through the sexual coupling of Gaia, the mother goddess, and Uranus, the sky god, which is an example of supernatural realms using to explain the nature of life in the universe. And indeed, myths usually have in them personifications, characters that are cosmic beings like Gaia, Uranus, Zeus, etc. And indeed, what we find in history, going back to ancient history, is that humans frequently saw personalities embedded within nature around them, which is called animism. They saw the world and the universe as enchanted, as filled with personified beings that had various fantastic powers. Now, all of this is going to have things to do with science fiction. Often myths had in them end of the world prophecies, going beyond the here and now. And so one thing that the history of myths show us is that future consciousness is not something that recently arose in the human mind, but goes back to the very beginnings of recorded history, where there were myths and stories about how the world would end and what the ultimate purpose and direction of things was. Indeed, overall, what we see in myths is how humans are able to explore and extend human imagination to the far-reaching possibilities of whatever could be conceivable. So humans have been imagining things beyond the here and now, beyond the ordinary for thousands and thousands of years. And myths show that. And further, they believed in these stories. They believed that these transcendent, fantastical beings and realities actually existed. And their perceptions and their understanding of nature around them and of the here and now was influenced by these beliefs. They talked to the gods and goddesses. They talked to various mythical beings. They saw them. And indeed, many people still do who believe in such stories. And they provided people with meaning, explanation, purpose, and value in their lives. So myths have a long history involving the fantastical and the transcendent. People have believed in the stories. A lot of people still believe in the stories and the characters in them. And this is a very significant set of features of what myths do and how myths arose and what they're all about. Now, if we come at myths and fantasy a bit different, we could look at some dictionary definitions. And an understanding of myth, which is very common, is that a myth is a fictitious story, person, or thing. Fictitious, meaning it's not supposed to be real. It isn't thought of as real. What does the word fantasy mean? These are dictionary definitions. Produced by the imagination, involving magic and supernatural phenomena. Takes place in imaginary worlds where magic and magical creatures are common. So notice in there and underneath the definition of fantasy that the terms magic and supernatural get highlighted. So if you look up magic, you find a power of apparently influencing the course of events by using mysterious or supernatural forces. That's a dictionary definition. So then if you look up supernatural, what you get is a dictionary definition, is attributed to some force beyond scientific understanding of the laws of nature. Okay, so here we come to a very significant point if we follow through on these definitions, is that fantasies seem to involve ideas that go beyond what we think of as being a credible scientific understanding of reality. And hence, within a scientific theory of reality, fantasies and our traditional, and our opening definition there of a myth as fictitious, lack credibility and personal and practical value because they're contradicted by science. Now, science did not exist 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, at least not as it does today. So myths and fantasy are seen as not plausible, not credible, because they don't agree with our present way of thinking about reality within science. But the problem is, given this definition, is that I would gather that a huge percentage of people across the globe still believe in the credibility and plausibility of these ancient myths, fantasies, the supernatural and the magical. So if we look to see how many people believe in the supernatural, how many people believe in the Garden of Eden story, how many people believe in Noah's Ark, et cetera, we'll find huge percentages of people, or that, for example, the archangel, who was it? Which one was it? The one that talked to Muhammad, the archangel that talked to Muhammad. Anyway, people believe in them. So even if they're contradicted apparently by science and our scientific understanding, people still believe in them. And this goes to show the power of transcendent consciousness, that humans have imaginations. Humans like to understand the big picture. They like to make sense out of what does it all mean. And they use their imagination to do that. And consequently, even if we find that in different ways, their stories may be contradicted by the ideas in science, they still will go ahead and believe in them because they give them meaning, purpose, and value. Now, at this point, let's look at a more, what would I call it? A positive vision of myth. And I'm going to draw this off of Joseph Campbell and The Power of Myth, and Carl Jung and his writings on myths and archetypes. And these are quotes from Joseph Campbell. A myth is what we're seeking is an experience of being alive, the rapture of being alive. And I'm highlighting key terms here, rapture. Mythology is the song of the imagination. Myth serves four functions, and the first is the mystical, realizing what a wonder the universe is and what a wonder you are, and experiencing awe before the mystery. But myths also offer life models. The models have to be appropriate, though, to the time you're living in. And then archetype, which is a key concept in this, from Jung, an original pattern or model represented by some image, persona, or symbol. Jung, a deep and fundamental idea, a unit of meaning, or a theme motif within the human mind. From Campbell, common persona or themes in myths and stories from around the world, and indeed the truth or value of myths. So archetypes are basically fundamental units of meaning or themes or symbols that we find in myths. And these have truth value. They tell us something about the way we think, about our deep ideas. And we're going to find archetypes, many, many different kinds of archetypes, both in myths and in science fiction. But notice that Joseph Campbell takes a much more positive view as to the value of myths. And I have a quote up here from Rollo May, the famous psychologist. Myths are archetypal patterns in human consciousness, and where there is consciousness, there will be myth. Now, here's another definition of a myth, and this is off of Wikipedia, not out of a dictionary. A traditional, typically ancient story dealing with supernatural beings, those are the transcendent beings, ancestors or heroes that serve as a fundamental type in the worldview of a people, as by explaining aspects of the natural world, they're delineating the psychology, customs, or ideals of society. Now, what that definition is saying is that a myth as a story expresses and tells you something fundamental about the society and the people and what they believe that created that myth. And they often involve identifications of fantastical, transcendent, or supernatural beings as part of that story. So if we go from that definition, up here I have a short statement from Olaf Stapleton, and this comes out of his novel Last and First Men, and it's in the introduction. And his statement is, our aim is not merely to create aesthetically admirable fiction, nor achieve neither mere history nor mere fiction, but myth. A true myth is, I can't read my own writing, is that which in the universe of a certain culture expresses richly and often perhaps tragically the highest admirations possible in that culture. Now, what Stapleton is getting at there, and this connects back to that definition I just put up, is that a myth is the credible and inspiring transcendent, a creation of imagination in the form of a story that both is seen as plausible and is inspiring. Now, the stories written 7,000 years ago may no longer to a lot of people seem credible, but they did seem credible at the time, and many people still see them as credible, and they express something deeply about how that group of people think and how they see reality, and they are inspiring. Now, there's a very good partial history of science fiction, The World Beyond the Hill, by husband and wife Alexei and Corey Panchin, who were science fiction writers. And that's exactly what Panchin argue about myths. Myths are the credible transcendent, and science fiction is the modern credible transcendent. I would add into that science fiction hits you at an emotional level too, so it produces awe and wonder as well as give you some transcendent understanding of reality. And so in that sense, the Panchins believe that science fiction now has taken the place of ancient myths because it serves the same function, which is to provide credible and inspiring stories of the transcendent, of the fantastical, of beyond the here and now. And it's informed by science, though, as opposed to ancient theories of reality. So that's what makes it credible. Now, if we look at the qualities of mythic consciousness, and I put up this slide before in the introduction, between looking at Campbell and looking at Jung and other sources like Panchin too, on the nature of mythic consciousness, I've come up with this, what is it? It's 14 different qualities of myth, you know, from being narrative, it having truth value, personifications, archetypal, cosmic, fantastical, giving personal meaning, has an emotional, motivational dimension, has an ethical dimension, is aesthetic, gets people in immersive participation, rites and rituals. It has icons and symbols, and it stimulates holistic future consciousness. Those are all qualities, not holistic future consciousness, holistic consciousness. Those are all qualities, I think, of mythic consciousness, of myth. And I brought up in the introductory webinar that science fiction has all of these qualities, every one of them. And now I'd just like to go through a little more closely where these qualities show up in science fiction and how. Let's just begin with the obvious one. Science fiction involves narratives, and often engaging narratives that grab the reader, grab the viewer, and draw you in, have an impact on you personally. And I put up here 3 classic examples of engaging narratives from 3 of the great science fiction writers, The Island of Dr. Moreau by Wells, and The Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and The Path Through Tomorrow by Robert Heinlein. Those are three highly engaging stories that tap into a number of different human emotions. And all three of those writers produce many, many stories along those lines. They would grab you, hold you, pull you along through an incredible story. Science fiction has an abundance of fantastical characters, just like an ancient myth. Up here we have images of Old Faithful, a Martian, Tweel, a Martian, and Curl, the Black Destroyer. These are three famous fantastical aliens in the history of science fiction. And if you haven't run across them, there are three highly recommended stories. The O Faithful is the same title. Tweel is from A Martian Odyssey, and Curl, who sucks the potassium out of humans, is from Black Destroyer. So science fiction has lots of different fantastical creatures and characters. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of aesthetics and art and icons and images in science fiction too, often to the point where they're objects of worship. I'll even come back to that. And finally, science fiction deals with the cosmic and fantastical and generates mystery, awe, and wonder, and you explore the universe. Three great cosmic science fiction stories are Vacuum Diagrams, which involves the past and future history of the universe, and creating God, who then creates the universe. Permutation City, which is by Greg Egan, that goes into a indefinitely expansive virtual reality. And The Rapture of the Nerds, which draws a comparison between the Christian notion of the rapture coming and the nerds' notion of the rapture coming through being uploaded into computers and living in virtual reality. And the last one is rather funny, but it's cosmic at the same time. And up here, just in case you're interested, there's a YouTube link to a dialogue between Charles Stross and Cory Doctorow, two contemporary science fiction writers, talking about how they created the rapture of the nerds. And so if you don't have time to get it down, you could, of course, contact me and I'll give you the link. This is an interesting discussion between the two of them. Now, one thing I just mentioned before, icons. Who is that? That's Hal. Everybody knows it. Who is that? That's Darth Vader, another icon. Who's this? Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein. Metropolis Robot, an alien. 2001, The Terminator, Big Brother, The Time Machine. The image from Planet of the Apes with the Statue of Liberty buried in the sand. A giant worm from Dune. The Star Trek Enterprise, and one that you may not be so familiar with, but is a significant icon in science fiction, is Alfred Bester's Tiger Tiger, or The Star's My Destination, where the central character, whenever he gets angry, has stripes come out of his face. And that's a very significant icon in science fiction. In fact, here's three others that you may not be familiar with that are very iconic. The aliens from The Shadow Out of Time by H.P. Lovecraft, and that's exactly what they look like. And that story is a real trip. Aesop, the story by Clifford Simak dealing with the robot Jenkins and the dogs that talk. And Shamblu by Catherine Moore, which is a seductive female alien that is a Medusa. And that's one of the earliest science fiction novels that gets explicitly sexual, but she's an icon, clearly so. So science fiction has lots of icons, lots of classical images that are part of it. Now, other qualities, how science fiction motivates you into action, how it's immersive. Of course, I've gone over this already, the fans and the conventions and how it stimulates people into living a certain way of life, just like myths do. It's ethical and prescriptive about the future. It provides both utopias and dystopias. Some utopias are Men Like Gods by H.G. Wells and The Coming Race. Dystopias like City of Endless Night, Warnings, or 1984, A Parable of the Talents. Lots of dystopias written, warning us not to go down certain pathways. But science fiction points out ways to go and ways not to go. Now, archetypes, the next one on the list there, archetypes are supposed to be fundamental units of meaning that are contained in human consciousness. And a question I have asked about the archetypes in science fiction, such as the rocket ship, the robot, the alien, is whether the archetypes in science fiction actually evolve. And this is an image of the evolving archetype of the robot in science fiction, because this is from Ex Machina. And here we have a evolving and a significantly kind of transformed image of a robot that's much, much different than the earlier images of robots that we had. So the archetypes may be evolving, the aliens may be evolving in how we think of them. Now, truth value. People often ask, does science fiction accurately predict the future? Well, lots of times in various ways it does. And I have up here 4 classic novels that highlight various ways in which the future, as anticipated in these novels, actually does come to pass. Sometimes actually it influences the way things go. But we also have up here a quote from Arthur C. Clarke that, you know, science fiction gets into truth in a very fundamental way, in that it asks, what is the nature of ultimate reality? What are the answers to the deepest questions, the most significant issues? So it isn't that science fiction just predicts. Science fiction in the form of narratives tries to address, like myths did, what is this all about? What does this all mean? What is the universe? What's out there? What is our place in it? And it generates what I would call mythic, holistic future consciousness. Arthur C. Clarke is a great example of this. 3 of his best novels, 2001, Rendezvous with Rama, and Childhood's End, all have mythic qualities, all stimulate holistic future consciousness. Now, here I have a slide where I just wanted you to have a look at this and notice on the left side, I have images that are fantasy. On the right side, I have images that are from science fiction. And notice how well they line up with each other. There are things that have changed, like instead of a magic wand, we have a laser gun. Instead of an angel surrounded by light, we have a robot surrounded by light. Instead of a rocket ship ascending into the sky, we have an angel ascending into the sky. Instead of a super city with great towers, we have a fantasy castle. Instead of dragons and demons, we have aliens. But notice how the imagery between these two, between fantasy on one hand and science fiction on the other hand, can be very, very similar. Now, Thierry, what time is it right now? This may be a good spot to stop in the middle. I'm not sure. Where are we with the time?
I have 41 after.
41 after. Okay, that's probably a good place to stop just for the moment, because I think that's about halfway. Is in imagery, in the types of characters and visualization between ancient myth, fantasy, and science fiction. Now, I have up here 2 really classic examples that a lot of people probably have seen, the movies, of science fiction movies that had mythic narratives. First one is Close Encounters. In Close Encounters, we have a human who starts to receive psychic messages from some unknown transcendent reality and has these visions that are unbelievable and is drawn on a journey to try to find out what this all means, and eventually encounters in the process this fantastical, wondrous spaceship with these angel-like beings who bring him inside of their incredible spaceship, which in the interior looks like some kind of huge cathedral with lights and motion and a big Christmas tree, and he ascends into heaven. That's definitely a mythic story with science fiction trappings. In 2001, we have our ancestors being purposively manipulated in their brains through some kind of technological system that makes them smarter so they could begin to use tools. And then we're drawn on a journey with a signal from the heavens again, and we journey to the outer reaches of the solar system, where the final character is transformed by having to die in the process, death and resurrection, and reemerges as an ethereal star child or being of light. So in this case here, super advanced and mysterious aliens are facilitating our evolution from ape to human to star child. And in both cases, we have transcendent realities. We're being manipulated. We have messages sent to us. These are both very, very mythic tales, very similar to lots of ancient mythic tales, except they're framed in terms of science fiction with spaceships, aliens, and super technologies. Now, we can go even further with noticing similarities between myth and science fiction. I have up here some significant examples of where we transpose, retell, and remix myths and archetypes in science fiction settings. The Death Bird, which won Best Novella in Science Fiction, Hugo, back in the 1970s, is a retelling of the Garden of Eden story. And in the story as retold, God is the bad guy, the devil is the good guy, and let's not blame poor Eve for the fact that she goes ahead and bites the apple. It's a retelling of the Garden of Eden. In Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny, and I mentioned this story before, this novel before, which also won the Hugo for Best Novel when it came out, we have all of the major Hindu deities in the Buddha who are actually in the novel humans who exist in the far distant future, who their technology has become so advanced that they can incorporate into them all of the powers that the ancient Hindu gods presumably had, and they go by those very names. Ilium, by Dan Simmons, the same writer who wrote Hyperion, Ilium takes place on Mars, where there has been a recreation of the siege of Troy. And all of the characters from the Iliad are there. Hector and Achilles and Helen of Troy. And Troy is under siege. And the real question right off the bat is, how could this possibly be happening? And this is happening in the future. And you have to follow through on it. But in fact, in this version of the siege of Troy, there's a twist. And things don't go the same way as they did in the original Iliad. And finally, from Robert Silverberg, which I think is a classic exposition on the relationship of science fiction and myth, Breckenridge and the Continuum is a story about a man who lives in our present life, present circumstances, and finds himself transposed to this barren world in which he's on this march with a bunch of other characters across this open desert. And while they're walking across the desert, Breckenridge starts to tell the other characters stories. And what he does is he takes ancient myths and ancient fables and he starts mixing them together in different ways. And in so doing, he creates new myths for the people that are listening to him. So Silverberg presents the idea here is that science fiction could be seen as, let's take the old up with new versions and new combinations. Now, something that I've been bringing up here is this issue of the similarities between myth, fantasy, and science fiction. But on the other hand, I have this quote here. It's from the 17th century from Bernard de Bouvier de Fontenelle, Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds. This is a very significant book of the 17th century in the evolution of science. And basically what Fontenelle says in this quote is that previously, before science, the heavens appeared as a blue vault and the universe was confined within narrow bounds, and I felt oppressed. Presently, seeing the universe for what it is, the world seems much more expansive. The universe seems much more magnificent. It's opened up in front of me. And this is going to be a basic argument I'm going to present right now about the difference between myth and fantasy and science fiction. It's clear that myths and fantasies were seen as plausible in ancient theories of reality. And I have up here City of God by St. Augustine, which is a fantastical story of our future, and Camille Flammarion's Omega, in which Flammarion recounts lots of different stories of the end of the world created by ancients. And they had visions of transformed futures, of the end of times, as I've mentioned before. Now, our stories in science fiction, the fantastical and the mythic, is set in a scientific cosmos and a transformed future. And the transformed future is due to advances in astronomy and technology and progress in the science of evolution. We've reconceptualized the future and reality with the development of science. So science fiction adopts a scientific theory of reality, the future, and what is credible. And Fontenelle's argument here, and this would be the argument that I would present with respect to ancient myth and ancient fantasies, is that the universe envisioned within contemporary science is much more expansive, much more complex, and much more mysterious than anything that we imagined before. That is, our ancient myths are really very narrow and paltry in terms of their scope and depth and wonder. That is, our science fiction stories, when they get cosmic, when they get very speculative, ascend way, way beyond anything the ancients ever produced. And it's a continually evolving universe of possibilities, vocabulary, and new ideas. So so fundamentally, the argument that I'm presenting to you here is that our knowledge has evolved. And what we believed and what we thought 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, there could be a lot of validity in it. Of course, there is. But our understanding of the universe today vastly, vastly exceeds our understanding of the universe 3,000, 4,000 years ago. So we're in a different reality, and that's what's informing science fiction, a totally different reality, even if it has a lot of the same mythic qualities. But, and I'm gonna keep making it kind of complicated for you. From Robert Goddard, who was the great American rocketry scientist, it is difficult to say what is impossible, for the dream of yesterday is the, geez, I can't see my own quotes because I put my picture in front of them. The dream of yesterday is above about today and the reality of tomorrow. Okay, now, the scientifically plausible versus implausible. Now, can we make a clear distinction between what is scientifically plausible and implausible? Does it show up in science fiction? I have up here two very famous stories of Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth and Off on a Comet. By the time Verne wrote Journey to the Center of the Earth, the scientific consensus was that the Earth was not hollow, which people had believed before, and it wasn't filled with caverns that you could explore, but he still created a story and then tried to argue why it has some plausibility to it, that the Earth was in fact hollow and you could journey down into it. So he did not go along in that story what was considered scientifically plausible in the 1860s. And Off on a Comet, a chunk of the Earth ends up lodging itself on a comet and zips around through the solar system, which is totally scientifically implausible. But he has a lot of science in the story, but it doesn't really resonate with what people thought would be, from an astronomical point of view, would be plausible. How would the entire Mediterranean basin lodge on top of a comet? And then everybody on it would stay alive for a few months. And in fact, Paul Feyerabend, the philosopher, points out that science isn't some total consensus of what is plausible or what is credible. There's different ideas in science about what is plausible and credible. And science fiction, in fact, pushes the limits about what is plausible, coming up with ideas that maybe, in fact, a lot of scientists would say are implausible. Like the Chronicles of the Lensman and Alfred Bester in The Demolished Man, The Stars My Destination, and Edgar Rice Burroughs all had ideas in their science fiction novels that when they were written, science would have said, this is totally implausible. Chronicles of Lensman had individuals who with a technological device could read other people's minds, manipulate their minds, enter into their consciousness and manipulate the consciousness of another. In The Stars My Destination, we had people who could read minds. And, in The Demolished Man, we had people who could read minds. In The Stars My Destination, we had people who could, by closing their eyes and imagining it, move from one physical spot to another just by wishing it. And Edgar Rice Burroughs had lots of implausibilities in his visions of Mars, in his Mars series, that people by the time he wrote that series would have said, this isn't what Mars is like at all. So lots of times science fiction writers challenge what is plausible, contradict what is plausible, go beyond what is plausible relative to science. So that makes things a bit murky when we say that science fiction is inspired by science. And indeed, in philosophy and science, one finds a mixture often of the religious and theistic and the scientific. And I have a quote here from Isaac Newton, the great scientist of the first scientific revolution, in which he basically is saying that the beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets is under the dominion and consular control of an intelligent and powerful God. And that's what he believed. So he was a scientist, but he definitely believed in spirits. And in fact, in these 4 novels I have up here, and the 2 movies I have up here, The New Atlantis, Lumen, Star Maker, and River of Gods, there's a mixture in them of theistic and theological ideas and scientific ideas. We have a God in Olaf Stapleton. We have a God in Lumen. We have God-believing, praying individuals in the New Atlantis, and we have Hindu gods in the River of Gods. In Star Wars, we have the Force. What is that? In the Matrix, we have the capacity to manipulate things with one's mind and to be able to resurrect oneself from the dead. So the mystical and the theistic gets mixed together a lot of times within science fiction. So to push it to the extreme, we have Philip Dick. And Philip Dick here, this quote from Philip Dick: in my writing, I question the universe. I wonder out loud if I am real or if anything around this is real at all. And so Dick takes the question of what is plausible or possible in his science fiction to the extreme. That is, nothing is out of bounds for him in his science fiction. In The Man in the High Castle, we're in a world where Germany and Japan won World War II. and Ubik were dead, and we're talking to the dead. In counterclock world, everything moves backwards in time. In time out of joint, Marilyn Monroe doesn't exist. And the list can go on and on and on here. In that, Dick created speculative fiction, often informed by science, that pushed scenarios out to whatever could be possible within his imagination. And so, of course, lots of us have thought, well, is this real, what we're in? Am I real? Do I really exist? Is this a dream? That kind of stuff comes up in Dick. What is reality? Comes up in Dick. So Dick does not stay constrained in what we would take to be a scientific vision at all. And Dick is considered one of the greatest science fiction writers of the mid-20th century. So here's where we come to sort of like a conclusion on myth and fantasy versus science fiction. John Clute, one of the authors of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, says there's no absolute distinction between fantasy and science fiction. You can't draw a clear, unambiguous line. And Nichols, who is a co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, says there's no historical clear dividing line where we go from fantasy to science fiction. Roberts, in his history of science fiction, says there's a continuum, but a tension between fantasy on one hand, hard science fiction with a lot of tech and very clearly scientifically explained, and lots of stuff in the middle. So if science fiction has historical roots in fantasy and mythology and pulls together lots of different influences and is a very diverse reality, then even though in general it is informed and inspired by contemporary science, there's lots of different tributaries that mix and cross-fertilize each other. And in fact, later on, we'll talk about things like Slipstream and the New Weird, which combine a little bit of a lot of different things. So you can make a general distinction between fantasy and science fiction, but you can't get too real definite and absolute about it because there's lots of creatures in the middle between both of them where they mix things together. Still, I want to say that science fiction then is the mythology of the future. It's myths about the future to inspire us for the future. It provides credible new myths that basically are informed and inspired by science and contemporary thought, basically. And so it expands our possibility space in our minds. Because as I said before, and just to repeat it, contemporary science is much more mind expansive than anything humans produced 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. There's no comparison. But secondly, it engages us and gets us into thinking about the future and how to possibly create a better future and avoid bad ones. So it both stimulates and expands our minds and moves us into action. Here's a image from an article that appeared in The Futurist by Stanley Krippner, which I found very fascinating. It came out actually about 20 years ago. And Krippner argued that for the new millennium, we need new myths. The old myths don't work anymore. They're not credible anymore. And what I'm arguing or presenting here is that the new myths for the new millennium are science fiction. And it's not one story, but many different ones. Now, here's where science fiction goes beyond the future. Got a couple slides left. Very famous science fiction story of the 1930s by Jack Williamson, a very significant science fiction writer throughout the entire 20th century, called The Legion of Time. Imagine that you live in a world, our present world, in which in this world there is a character named John Barr. John Barr is walking across a field, and he is going to come to a point where he is going to look down at the ground, and he's either going to notice that there is a magnet, an old rusted magnet lying there on the ground, or he isn't going to notice it. If he notices the magnet and picks it up, it leads to one definite future for all of humanity. If he doesn't notice the magnet and doesn't pick it up, it leads to an entirely different future for all of humanity. And indeed, these two possible futures that are based on a simple little act of picking up the magnet or not picking up the magnet create two different possible futures which travel back in time to our present and attempt to influence John Barr in whether he will pick the magnet up or not. Now your head's going spinning around. The incident of John Barr either picking the magnet up or not ends up in science fiction being referred to as a John Barr point. It's a point in history where if you do one thing, everything goes in one direction, and if you do something simple, very different, everything goes in an entirely different direction. And in the Legion of Time, actually, there are two different futures that are fighting with each other over which one is going to be realized. Now, let's push it a little further. We have a character who lives in a world in which the Confederates won the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War. And he is in a debate with another scholar about the Civil War, whether Lee won the Battle of Gettysburg because he was smarter than Meade, or was it just luck? And he encounters a woman who builds a time machine. And he wants to go back and observe the Battle of Gettysburg to see whether it was Lee's military genius or sheer luck that won the Battle of Gettysburg. And so he goes back, but the woman who created the time machine told him, do not get anywhere near anybody so they see you because you could fuck up all of history. But stupidly, he goes back and goes and stands right near Little Round Top. And a patrol of Confederates who were going up the hill to take Little Round Top see him, stop, investigate what he's doing there, get into an argument. The captain of the Confederate troop gets shot, and they never get to the top of Little Round Top, and Lee doesn't win the Battle of Gettysburg. And we live in the reality that was inadvertently created by this character going in a time machine back through time and screwing up what actually did happen at the Battle of Gettysburg. So let's bring the Jubilee. And that's an alternate reality scenario. And that's something that science fiction gets into, which is that this is one reality we're in right now. In The Man in the High Castle, we have a different reality where the Germans won World War II. In The Difference Engine by Gibson and Sterling, we have a reality where computers are invented in the 19th century. And steampunk, in fact, is a whole genre in science fiction which deals with a reality in which things happen in the 19th century that never really happened in our reality. And just as some other examples, there's the example I brought up about city and going off into other dimensions. The Neanderthal parallax, where the Neanderthals survive and become civilized and we go extinct. The Time Ships by Stephen Baxter, in which all possible universes are grasped at the same time. What Mad Universe, in which a character wakes up in a universe that's like a science fiction novel and had worked in science fiction. And then Perdido Street Station, which is in the new weird genre, in which we're in a world in which there are humans that have wings and are like eagles, and insects with human heads, and giant moths, and lizard people, and all kinds of strange and fantastical stuff, alternate realities. So science fiction definitely gets into more than the future, it gets into alternate realities. But these alternate realities, of course, expand our mental space. And that's why they're relevant to the creation of the future, because they get us thinking about different possible and strange realities that fertilize our imagination. And finally, we come to, this question about the evolutionary mythology of science fiction. We have a quote up here: "The future ain't what it used to be, and it never was." First way in which science fiction is evolutionary is that science fiction grows across time. And so there's a cumulative heritage to science fiction. It builds on itself. People write things, and then people later on write other things like time travel and space travel, which are informed from the things written before. So science fiction is not this static body of ideas, it's this evolutionary body of ideas. It's a self-reflective think tank. So it's evolving in that sense. Secondly, science fiction is informed by the theory of evolution and cosmic evolution in particular. And so when science fiction writers think about the cosmos as a whole or what's going to happen in the future, the fundamental framework that they use, which comes from science now, is cosmic evolution. And an example of that, which I'll use here to illustrate this point, is these three novels up here: The Time Machine, Last and First Men, and Diaspora. These novels were written in 1895, 1930, and 1997. So they're each about 40 years apart, okay, over a period of 100 years. All of them involve speculations on the future of humanity. All of them are informed by the theory of evolution, but each of them is written at a later point than the previous one. And so H.G. Wells' understanding of evolution in 1895 led to one view about where we were headed in the next million years. Olaf Stapleton, 35 years later, had a much bigger vision of evolution and extrapolated out 2 billion years into the future with 18 different species and lots of new stuff thrown in from evolution that Wells never threw in, like redesigning the human body technologically and biologically. In Diaspora, which is written toward the tail end of the 20th century, informed by the theory of evolution, envisions in the future 3 different kinds of humans: one biological and unaltered, one robotic, and one virtual, which based on contemporary thinking about where evolution could be heading. So our visions of the future of humanity are evolving because our ideas of evolution are evolving, although all these 3 examples are examples of theories of the future of humanity, not theories, theories of the future of humanity based on particular theories. So science fiction is an evolving expression of holistic future consciousness. In fact, I'll put up here, here's 5 other famous novels about future humans too. There's been lots of them. And it's purposively facilitating the evolution of humanity and heightened future consciousness. So the myths that we're telling today, which are scientifically informed in science fiction, generally speaking, as expressions of heightened future consciousness, are stimulating our consciousness and our mind and are giving us possibilities and inspiring us and are actually facilitating our own mental evolution and general human evolution. And that's how it's evolutionary. Mythology. So just in summary, I talked about the history, nature of myth and fantasy. I talked about the concept of the credible and inspiring transcendent, the mythic dimensions of science fiction, the relative distinction between myth, fantasy, and science fiction. It's only relative, it's not absolute. That science fiction is myths about the future for the future. Alternate realities as another thing science fiction gets into, and John Barr points, and why it's evolutionary mythology. And people that I covered today include Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth, the Pansions in The World Beyond the Hill, Jules Verne, Camille Flammarion, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Alfred Bester with The Demolished Man, Philip Dick, the Lensman series, Greg Egan with Diaspora and Permutation City. Should mention those are 2 really mind-boggling, great contemporary science fiction novels that are very cosmic. Greg Egan, 2001, Star Wars, and The Matrix. So next week, or not 2 weeks from now, we're doing ancient history through the Middle Ages, 1000 BC to 1500 AD. And that should be the end.